I want to thank all of you for being here this morning. The Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture will now come to order. This morning's subject matter is the implementation of the Farm Bill International Food and Assistance and Development Programs, an effort that our country has been engaged in for decades, and a program that I believe has, or programs I should say, plural, real merit, and in so many different ways, addresses the basic needs of humanitarian assistance around the world, and really, as the richest nation in the world, I think puts America in responding to the needs that are so many out there, and really shows us attempting to put our very best foot forward. We want to hear from the testimony this morning from our two witnesses on the implementation of last year's bipartisan reauthorization of the Farm Bill as it relates to international assistance and the development programs that were part and parcel of that reauthorization. Last year, 80 million people around the world required food assistance that we participated. I suspect the number is greater than that. Over 150 million children under the age of 5 are stunted, it's believed, as a result of malnutrition by various international studies. More than 11 million people alone who have been displaced in Syria and Yemen that are living in refugee camps, we know have been suffering for years as a result of that civil war. And clearly we and the European Union and others are doing what we can, but I suspect more needs to address that. Certainly when I've spoken to the King of Jordan and others, they talk about the great impact that those refugee camps have had. According to the United Nations, the risk of hunger and malnutrition could increase by up to 20% by the middle of this century as a result of climate change and increased population. And let me give you a little perspective on that. About 3 years ago, the planet clicked 7 billion people. Now, to give you some perspective, over 200 years ago, we had 1.7 billion. So in 200 years, we've gone from about 1.7 billion people to 3 years ago, over 7 billion people. And it's estimated by the middle of this century, there will be an additional 2 billion people throughout the world. That's 2 billion more people that need nutrition and need a reliable source of nutrition that goes beyond subsistence. So that's the challenge out there. And obviously, as the chair and members of this subcommittee participate, I also have the good fortune to be on the Foreign Relations Committee, we look to see how we can mitigate and solve these programs through a combined of the best of bipartisan leadership that we have in our country. And so that bipartisan leadership goes back decades. The McGovern-Dole Food for Education, obviously, were by Senators Dole and Senators McGovern, that provided progress and food for peace to build a more prosperous world that provides assistance from American people. And when you look about that efforts going back in the 1980s to today and fast forward, last year we provided almost $4 billion in assistance from the United States in a host of these different programs. $4 billion. That's significant. In the fiscal year 2018, the McGovern-Dole Food for Education program reached over 4 million of the most vulnerable women, infants, and children. And Food for Progress provided nearly 70,000 people to improve their technologies for food for peace, and Title II programs served over 35 million beneficiaries. And to paraphrase a great comment that President Reagan indicated, it's as opposed to providing food, which is always so necessary. If you teach people how to, he was using a fishing analogy, but if you teach people how to grow food, then they can be subsistent on their own. And that's what these programs attempt to do, to enhance our national security, obviously, put our best foot forward, and that increases global security, stability, resiliency, and cooperation. Other efforts like the Farmer-to-Farmer program, the Borlaug program, and the Cochrane Fellowship help expand technical skills across agricultural value chains in the developing world. I've seen that firsthand in India, and it really is a program in which the Indians take a great deal of pride in and support, and it's obviously changed India's ability to provide food for themselves. Through these efforts, we are promoting international partnerships that are critical in this day and age, harmonizing standards that lead to, I think, mutually beneficial trading relationships, because when we have the same standard of food quality and food safety, obviously we can engage in greater trade. Through these efforts, we are promoting international efforts that I think reflect Congress's bipartisan support. So we will request from this administration that these programs continue to bring together a diverse set of important domestic stakeholders, and these stakeholders are American farmers, ranchers, dairymen and women who provide that food, who produce that food. Nobody does it better than the American farmer. And in providing that support, we improve livelihoods and we build partnerships throughout the breadbasket of America. And at the same time, we address disasters that occur for a combination of reasons around the world. So it's in that role that this subcommittee will ensure, and we want to hear this morning, how these programs, changes from the 2018 Farm Bill, are fully implemented. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and in consultation with the ranking member, pursuant to Rule 11E, I want to make sure that members of the subcommittee are aware that other members of the full committee may join us today, and I'll defer to the ranking member for his comments at this time. And the ranking member would like to defer to the ranking member of the full committee, former chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, the gentleman from Texas.
Well, thank you, Jim and David. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many thanks to our witnesses for taking time to be here today. I won't take much time, but I would like to say that we worked hard on provisions of the 2018 Farm Bill that made adjustments to our international food assistance and agriculture development programs. And as a proud supporter of the important work these programs do, I'm ready to hear more about how implementation is going. There's a strong partnership between USDA, USAID to carry out these programs, which I'm sure we will hear more about today. We also have a broad coalition of stakeholders, both in the United States and internationally, which is essential. Still, it's critical and absolutely crucial that food assistance and agricultural development efforts focus on building resilience, whether it is a disaster, economic downturns, or conflicts. Those we are helping in countries around the world, in places like Ethiopia, Nicaragua, Jordan, Cambodia, and our efforts must lead to greater capacity to weather their own challenges that come before them, and ultimately reduce hunger, poverty, and the need for U.S. intervention. With that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I'll now refer to the ranking member of this committee, Member Rouser, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony regarding international food assistance and development programs authorized in the Farm Bill and subsequent implementation by both the USDA and USAID. Now, this is our first hearing on international food assistance and agriculture development in this Congress. The food we deliver and development activities we promote are critical tools that feed people, build agriculture capacity, and foster goodwill between the United States and our friends around the world. This hearing today allows us an opportunity to review how the changes made in the Farm Bill have been executed thus far. American farmers play an important role in producing the crops that are delivered through in-kind food aid. A bag of rice, wheat flour, or any one of dozens of other products grown by U.S. farmers is a powerful symbol of the productivity and generosity of America. But it's not just farmers who are involved. As we know, in addition to the fine farm families and food processors here in the United States, Food assistance and international agriculture development rely on partnerships among USDA, USAID, the shippers and associated transportation industries, non-governmental organizations, international organizations such as the World Food Program, host country governments, other donor governments, third-party auditors, and American volunteers, among many, many others. This coalition of participation and support is what allows American agriculture assistance to fulfill such an important need around the world. And it is the rich history of U.S. generosity through in-kind food aid that makes this coalition possible. Food for Peace, an example of this important coalition in action, celebrated its 65th anniversary this year. Many other programs like Food for Progress, McGovern-Dole, the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust, and Farmer to Farmer have also built similar success. These programs help those in other countries produce their own food, learn more about production agriculture, and in the case of McGovern-Dole, encourages school attendance and learning by delivering a nutritious meal. This is how, over time, these programs lay the groundwork for individuals and families in impoverished countries to stand on their own 2 feet. In recent years, particularly since 2010, the U.S. has provided locally and regionally procured food and cash-based assistance in addition to in-kind food aid. Certainly, these are important tools in the toolkit of food aid delivery. There are certain circumstances, such as during conflict or where local markets are well-functioning, where U.S. agriculture commodities may not be the best option. But overwhelmingly, in many cases, U.S. agriculture products are in fact the best option. It is U.S. farm products covered with an American flag and delivered in countries of need that are the true backbone of the assistance the United States provides. It is critical that American agriculture in-kind assistance remain as the backbone for years to come. Thank you again to our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and we'll now begin with our witnesses. The presentation of their testimony. The members who request an opening statement, we have, for the record, may provide their testimony, and we'll forego that so there'll be ample time for questions. I'd like to obviously welcome our witnesses. The first is Ken Isley, Administrator of Foreign Agricultural Services at the United States Department of Agriculture. He was appointed in March 2018, and he leads the agency staff not only here in Washington, but 93 offices around the world that expand trade and export opportunities for American agriculture. If he seems familiar, it's because he is. He's been around for a while, and he grew up on his family's farm in Iowa. And so we look forward to hearing your comments. And please begin. You know the routine here. You have 5 minutes, and when the light turns yellow, you got a minute left. So please proceed.
Thank you very much. And good morning, Ranking Member Conaway, Chairman Costa, and other members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to appear today with my colleague Trey Hicks, Director of USAID's Office of Food for Peace. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the implementation of the international food assistance and capacity building programs administered by USDA. As Administrator of the Foreign Agricultural Service, I'm proud to represent the dedicated and talented women and men from our agency, and I want to thank you for your continued support. Last December, when Congress passed and President Trump signed the 2018 Farm Bill, the department immediately prioritized implementation, and we hit the ground running. The bill includes authorization, and in some cases funding, for USDA's agricultural development and capacity building programs. I am pleased to report that we effectively implemented all such programs for fiscal year 2019, publishing new regulations when necessary, and positioning ourselves to seamlessly implement programs as funded in fiscal year 2020. Our reauthorized programs include the Food for Progress program, the McGovern-Dole International Food for Education and Child Nutrition program, the local and regional food aid procurement program. The Farm Bill also amended two important fellowship programs, the Borlaug International Agricultural Science and Technology Fellowship Program and the Cochrane Fellowship Program. Each is being implemented without interruption. In August, we announced fiscal year 2019 Food for Progress Awards of more than $138 million to improve agriculture productivity in developing countries and expand trade projects planned for Africa, Asia, and South America are intended to reach over 238,000 beneficiaries directly over the next 5 years. Most recently, an updated Food for Progress regulation was published to reflect a Farm Bill required expansion of eligible entities to include U.S. public and nonprofit colleges and universities. For McGovern-Dole, fiscal year 2019 awards of $170 million were announced this summer to support school feeding programs in Cambodia, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Malawi, Mauritania, Mozambique, Togo, and Uzbekistan. These projects will provide school meals and nutrition programs for pregnant women, nursing mothers, infants, and children in countries with high food insecurity. Entering fiscal year 2020, McGovern-Dole had a total of 40 active projects valued at $961 million in 30 countries that are expected to reach over 4.5 million beneficiaries this year. In November, FAS published an updated McGovern-Dole regulation to implement a 2018 Farm Bill required change to provide for not more than 10% of program funds for local and regional procurement of commodities. This reflects new authority separate from an existing standalone LRP program. $15 million of fiscal year 2019 funds were provided for that standalone local and regional procurement program. USDA announced allocations in August for projects in Burkina Faso, Cambodia, and Nicaragua. These projects are estimated to reach more than 100,000 school children, augmenting over 20 million meals. Cochrane and Borlaug Fellowship programs offer mentoring to agribusiness representatives, researchers, policymakers with the aim to promote food security, trade, and economic growth. Under the 2018 Farm Bill, the programs continued operating this year without interruption, with fellowships awarded on a rolling basis. Recent training of Cochrane Fellows from Brazil's food, marketing, and distribution industries at the University of Nebraska led to a Brazilian company's purchases of high-quality U.S. beef. From selecting countries and priorities to reviewing proposals, evaluating project performance, and reporting projects, USDA's food assistance staff coordinate with colleagues at USDA. Collaboration does not just occur in Washington, it occurs throughout the world. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'd be pleased to answer any questions, including providing examples to illustrate these programs implemented by USDA.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And our next witness is Mr. Trey Hicks, Director of the Office of Food for Peace at the U.S. Agency for International Development. He was appointed Director on October 29th, 2018. He brings more than a decade of experience from the United States Senate, and he also has served with Congressman Ted Poe, and so he's a familiar face, and we appreciate his oversight efforts on foreign assistance. Please, thank you for your testimony, and please begin.
Chairman Costa, Chairman Peterson, Ranking Member Rouser, and Ranking Member Conaway, and other members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to discuss international food assistance programs. My name is Trey Hicks. I am the director of USAID's Office of Food for Peace, the largest provider of food assistance to the world's most vulnerable people. Our work represents America's generosity, and it is crucial and critical to our national security. We save lives, assist fragile countries recovering from crises, and help poor people take their first steps on their journey to self-reliance. Most of our work helps the hungriest people affected by conflict and natural disasters, including refugees. This year, 90% of Food for Peace funding supported emergency responses in 55 countries, helping tens of millions of people. We have also development programs that address the root causes of hunger in areas of chronic crises. These programs equip people with the tools to feed themselves, reducing the need for future assistance. Food for Peace provides life-saving food assistance in several ways. In some instances, we provide in-kind food grown in the United States or buy food locally or regionally. Other times, we provide vouchers or money, usually through electronic debit cards, so people can buy food at local markets. None of these options are better than the other. It depends on the context of each emergency. Given the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, I will focus on Title II programs, which are primarily used to buy food in the United States. When Food for Peace uses U.S. commodities, we work with NGOs like Catholic Relief Services or international organizations like the World Food Program. Our partners choose from dozens of U.S. commodities, which Food for Peace approves and buys on the open market. Next, we ship food from U.S. port to a recipient country. Upon arrival, the food is prioritized to reach the most vulnerable, primarily young children, women, and the elderly. U.S. food is critical in places like Yemen, where there are 20 million hungry people, more than the combined populations of Minnesota and North Carolina. In Yemen, conflict has led to less food in local markets, rising food prices, fewer job opportunities, and plummeting wages. 5 years into this conflict, families have used up their savings and can't afford to buy food. In response, Food for Peace provided more than 775,000 metric tons of food to partners in Yemen this year alone. One partner, the World Food Program, feeds up to 12 million people every month. We invest U.S. tax dollars responsibly. Food for Peace works under very difficult circumstances, like in Yemen, but we try to mitigate the risk through rigorous oversight, including third-party monitoring, biometric registration, and hotlines. We work with partners, other donors, and our Inspector General to identify risks and take steps to protect our assistance. We do not do this work alone. As Administrator Green has said, tackling hunger requires an all-hands-on-deck approach. So we work with State Department's Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration on overseas refugee efforts. The U.S. Department of Agriculture helps us buy Title II food. Our development activities are an essential component of Feed the Future, led by USAID's Bureau for Food Security. USAID has a long history of working with U.S. farmers, food manufacturers, and others to buy and transport food. We also look for opportunities to partner with private companies. While our programs are impactful, there are always room for improvement. The Famine Early Warning System Network predicts more than 88 million people will need emergency food assistance in 2020. To meet these needs, our programs must continue to evolve. The changes you made to the Food for Peace Act in the last Farm Bill improved efficiency and effectiveness, allowing us to save more lives. For example, Provision 207F gives us more funds for early warning, monitoring, and oversight, which makes our programs more effective. And in the fiscal year 2020 budget request, we include a single international humanitarian assistance account that would give us maximum flexibility to program food assistance using the most appropriate tool for each context to best meet needs. USAID is also undergoing a transformation to improve our work. Currently, Food for Peace works alongside the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. We provide emergency food and nutrition assistance while they tackle needs like shelter, medical care, and hygiene. The forthcoming Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance will bring our offices together, streamlining our humanitarian response. Before closing, I want to thank the Food for Peace team and our partners for delivering food assistance on behalf of the American people. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank you, Mr. Hicks, for your testimony, and we are pleased this morning to have both the chairman of the full committee and the ranking member of the full committee here, because They obviously put a great deal of effort in last year's reauthorization of the Farm Bill and are very interested in the implementation of these programs. As such, I will defer to the chair of the committee for any questions that he may have at this time.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your leadership. The question I have, I don't know which one of you can answer this, if you can. Dry pea and lentil prices have dropped between 40 and 50% since we've had these trade tariffs put in place. And peas and lentils are a staple in a lot of international food assistance programming. They have been since the 80s because they're widely eaten in diets around the world. But in recent years, Food for Peace and the McGovern-Dole Food for Education programs have purchased between 150,000 and 170,000 metric tons, but according to industry estimates, 2019 purchases of dry peas and lentils dropped to 110,000 metric tons without a major shift in recipient countries. So could you explain to me why there's such a drop in purchases on these commodities when you have extremely low prices and high stock levels?
Sure. So we currently purchase commodities using basically a zero-based budgeting approach, where every year we assess what the needs are in all the different contexts where we respond. We look at the availability of what's on the market, and we match the needs on the ground to what's available for purchase. So we don't have any kind of quotas or like set parameters. Every year is new, and we approach every year based on whatever the needs are. We are limited to how much is appropriated to us, and every year for what we can go out and purchase with Title II funding. Year to year, things are going to look different depending on the availability and kind of the context for each year. So there isn't a decision to increase or decrease based on pricing, but it's more based on the context year to year based on need.
It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, these countries have not reduced their demand for these products, and they actually cost less. So, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense, whatever you guys are up to.
Well, the drivers is the context. And so, for example, in Yemen, the most appropriate commodity for the needs that are driven by the demand and the context is wheat. So wheat tends to be one of our higher commodities that we use because of the need in Yemen is so great, and there aren't other alternatives for other commodities to be used in those kind of contexts. Pulses and beans are our third highest purchase, right behind wheat as well as the fortified corn soy blends. So while there might be a greater availability on the market, we have to look at each of the contexts and what the driving demand is for our programs to determine which crops are appropriate for us or which commodities are appropriate for us to purchase.
But I understand that there hasn't been a big shift in these recipient countries in terms of what they're asking for.
So there has been an uptick in food insecurity in Yemen, for example. We did a review an IPC review in December of last year. And it did show a spike of increase of need in Yemen, for example. And Yemen, again, is heavily reliant on wheat commodities for the response there. So, every year the context does shift and change. We have sudden onsets that appear like the response in Mozambique or the response in the Caribbean. And so the context is constantly shifting and changing. So there is changes in context, and I'm happy to provide more information on
my time is about expired, so I would appreciate that if you could get me some information. As I understand it, these purchases have been kind of constant at 150 to 170 metric ton ratio. So I don't understand why it's different. So get me whatever information you have, and I'll see if I can make sense out of it.
No problem.
Thank you. Yield back.
We thank the gentleman from Minnesota. And at this time, we'd like to defer to the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas.
Well, thank you, Jim. Appreciate that. Mr. Hicks, there was some conversation in the 18 Farm Bill process about how USAID distinguishes between the costs that are considered ITSH or internal transportation, shipping, and handling, and the funds that USDA is allowed to use to enhance program delivery through authorities under Section 203E of the Food for Peace program. There have been concerns regarding the claiming of costs for the uncapped ITSH purposes that should more appropriately be considered under the capped 202E spending. Please walk us through how those costs fall in each account and how the funds are tracked in each country.
Sure. So the internal transportation, storage, and handling cost is the cost that we have when food arrives in the country where we're going to deliver the food, and it includes the transportation to get to the warehouse as well as the storage and the security for the warehouse, and then it also covers things now because of the change such as milling, which is extremely important in countries like Yemen, where we are, even right now today, we have 150,000 metric tons of wheat on the water on its way to Yemen, that if we weren't able to use the change that you made to the ITSH cost to include milling, we wouldn't have been able to use quite that large amount of wheat and have it last as long as we needed to last to get to all the people we need to send it to. As far as tracking, we require vigorous reporting and monitoring at every stage of our response. So not just during the transportation stage, but also when we're targeting beneficiaries, when we're actually delivering the food. We have various stages where we ensure that the food is getting where it needs to go in a timely manner.
Yes, sir. I'm familiar with that, but I didn't hear anything about the CAP 202E spending. What costs go into that program?
So the 202E funding, the majority of that goes to the actual cost of administering the program. So it's staff salaries, it's monitoring and oversight, it's the kind of programmatic overhead. Because of the changes that were made a couple of farm bills ago, a portion of 202E does go to the flexibility of being able to use things like local regional purchases, but that's only about 7% of the total 20%, but the large majority of it goes to the actual administration of the program.
So a couple of times in your testimony, Mr. Hicks, you used the phrase the best or most appropriate tool or modality to get it there. I've always been concerned that there is a bias in your shop for cash and vouchers, and that in-kind purchases are going to get short shift. Somebody has to decide best. There's no real definition of that. It comes to the eye of the beholder. And like Mr. Peterson was getting at, as we see actual food purchases drop in an era where food costs have gone down, that doesn't make any sense to us that would be the case. And so I'm worried that your shop will push the blend, which is pretty close to 50-50 now, which is a lot higher than I thought it should be, but nevertheless, where we decided on it, that using your judgment, that you'll push it the other direction. So how can you assure the committee that those commodities which go in big 50-kilo sacks with an American flag on it don't get pushed to the side, because I think the American people support those programs more so than they do necessarily cash or vouchers. So how can you assure us that those of us who prefer in-kind aren't getting shut out in the decision-making in your shop?
Sure. Excellent question. I assure you, first and foremost, that we don't favor any type of response over the other. We sincerely look at every context individually to determine what the best response is. And when it comes to Title II, we use every dollar that you send us to the most efficient way we can to buy as much commodities as we can, to feed as many people as we can. But the increased cost is coming largely from security and access. We're increasingly using Title II in places like Yemen and South Sudan. We have to have Title II U.S. commodities, or we can't respond in places like Yemen and South Sudan. But there's also an increase in security costs. But every single dollar that we receive from you in Title II, we're spending those dollars. We're not.
Well, I'm real confident you're spending them. It's just the blend of being spent is how we want it. I want American farmers participating in this, and the American people support these programs in large part because they think that it's American grown products that are being used over there. So as you make those decisions, just know that American support for these programs lies in the fact that most folks think it's food that can't be stolen as easily as a $100 bill can be stolen. So appreciate your efforts, but we're going to watch because we sense a push the wrong direction. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for allowing you to ask questions.
Thank you, Congressman Conway, and I think the sentiment that you expressed is a concern that is shared on a bipartisan basis by this committee, and I thank both you and the chairman for your participation this morning. When you provide Mr. Hicks that information for the chairman that was referenced earlier, please provide it for the entire committee. I think that's something that we'd all like to be aware of, and we'll continue to provide oversight as we're doing today on the efforts of these programs. You know, the Farm Bill as a conferee, we all worked hard to ensure that various aspects were implemented. And on a bipartisan basis, the ranking member and I are carrying a resolution that will reflect the success of the Food for Peace program, and obviously we welcome everyone's participation in that resolution. Given the effectiveness of the Food for Peace program, I believe, and the support from stakeholders, I think it's clear and important that we maintain that bipartisan effort. So I'm a little bit baffled, and I'd like to ask this to both of you, why the administration's repeated budget request to zero out these programs. And it just doesn't make sense based upon both of your testimonies, and I think the support that you noted here by the subcommittee. Mr. Hicks, would you like to respond, and then would you like to your counterpart also respond as well?
No problem. So the current budget request seeks to combine all humanitarian accounts, not just Title II, but also IDA, as well as the Population Refugee Migration account that the State Department manages. The request merges all of those accounts into one new account. But this reflects a effort that goes back 2 administrations, back as far as 2008, where prior administrations, including the current administration, are seeking greater flexibility in how they can choose between the modalities of a response.
Mr. Isley, you care to respond?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. It's a question of efficiency in terms of the ability to effectively implement the program. I had some context in my written testimony in terms of the administration's desire to consolidate these type programs under USAID and implement them on a more bilateral basis to improve efficiency, monitoring, evaluation.
So how would the two of you work together then if in fact that were to take place?
We currently, what we currently do, we would continue to do. We would continue to partner with USDA for purchasing of commodities. They would continue to provide technical expertise on such things as supply chain management, the improvements that we're doing to the bulk bags that we're using to keep pests out.
Well, my sense is when you zero it out, though, that sends an entirely different message. Mr. Isley, in your written testimony, you specifically noted that the President's 2020 budget does not seek funds for Food for Progress or McGovern Dole, and instead prioritizes, as you noted, the USAID bilateral assistance, knowing that these programs, I think, help open doors to better trading relationships. Why does the administration want to diminish USDA and by proxy U.S. farmers and ranchers' role in this international food assistance effort?
Well, we would continue that, Mr. Chairman, with the coordination with USAID in terms of the implementation. In addition to the testimony from Mr. Hicks, USDA would be able to continue to assist because of our presence in the many embassies and consulates.
It seems it's diminishing the role of the USDA.
Well, it would still include our agriculture marketing service in terms of the procurement of the commodities that would go into the programs, and we would continue with our assistance with the expertise we have both in D.C. and around the world.
Due to instability and food insecurity as a result of conflict and climate change, what role do you think these programs play in our national security? And I guess you noted, I heard in your testimony, that you do consult with the State Department. Do you just consult with the Defense Department when targeting and prioritizing? As I noted in my opening comments, the civil war in Syria has resulted in displacement of millions of people in refugee camps. How's that coordination take place between yourselves and the State Department and the Department of Defense based on prioritization and need?
Sure. So at USAID, we participate in multiple interagency fora. We coordinate not only with ourselves, but also Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which is the other half of humanitarian assistance. And we have humanitarian advisors that are at all the...
So you meet in real time as these events take place?
Real time. In real time, we have advisors at all the comms that help advise.
And you meet periodically, and of course, with your 93 offices around the world.
Yes, sir. We meet periodically. Sometimes we have our staff in the field interfacing directly with DoD personnel at AFRICOM, different theaters.
My final question, I'll take the liberty of the chair, is chair of the, another hat I wear, Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. We work closely with the European Union. How well do you coordinate with the EU and other countries in different regions in the world?
So I actually hold regular bilateral meetings with the EU as well as others. And in fact, later this week, I'm meeting with a representative from Germany that leads their humanitarian effort. It's something that we regularly do bilaterally. We also meet together at the World Food Program board meetings and other type of donor meetings throughout the year.
So that's a regular occurrence, because certainly our partnership with our allies, I think, allow us to do more where the need is the greatest.
Absolutely, and we also coordinate with them in each response in the field as well. So there's a lot of coordination.
Well, thank you. My time's expired. I'd like to now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Rausser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to identify myself with Ranking Member Conaway and his concerns about the split. That is, in fact, as Chairman Costa mentioned, a major point of concern that is very much bipartisan, and I just want to stress that. Let me focus in at a little broader level. I am quite concerned with efforts by China and the EU in terms of their efforts around the world, in China in the case of putting in infrastructure in a lot of different places, EU and their anti-biotech bias, and the role that these programs play in helping to maintain American influence in the world. Mr. Isley, Mr. Hicks, can either one of you be willing to respond to that?
Sure, Congressman Rausser. The programs play an important role in addressing and reacting to some of the influences, and we share the concerns that you mentioned. I'd highlight in particular Food for Progress and some of the objectives in terms of the agricultural production regulations, the food safety regulations of some of the countries where we're implementing. These projects specifically address some of the influence of the EU around adoption of technology, key technologies like biotechnology, the responsible use of crop protection products and all. So they're critical in our ability to fund and to educate policymakers, decision makers in these countries. Also, in terms of branding U.S. Agriculture support for the school feeding and the Food for Progress projects, it's important to get recognition to the United States in terms of all the money, humanitarian and otherwise, that we provide. But it's real in the field and the influence of the countries you mentioned.
Mr. Hicks?
I would just add that China really isn't a donor, humanitarian donor. There's some places where there might be claims that they're providing humanitarian assistance, but it's not through humanitarian principles. There's a lot of strings attached. I'll also say that, you know, we at Food for Peace, we have no problem with using technologies such as GMO and other types of technologies that maybe the EU is slow to take on. But Mr. Isley and I yesterday were at the swearing in of Ambassador Kip Tom, who's our ambassador to Rome-based agencies for agriculture and food assistance, and he is a very strong supporter of pushing EU in the right direction to embrace technologies that could help us feed more people more safely, more efficiently. So,
Yeah. Well, I just think it's important to underscore the role that these programs play in terms of maintaining and enhancing America's influence in the world when we have a lot of actors out there that don't share the same values that we have. Mr. Hicks, moving on, you mentioned in your written testimony with regard to the Food for Peace, the variety of approaches used to verify aid is reaching the intended beneficiary. You listed out some of those methods. Can you provide some examples of how those programs are monitored to ensure the right aid is getting to the correct recipients? That's obviously a key component.
yes, sir, I agree. So we actually do monitoring and oversight at every stage of our delivery. And the most important stage is at the beginning when we actually identify who the beneficiary is. We use an extensive amount of data collection through our famine early warning system, which many of you are familiar with. We have staff in the field, our partners assist us, and we help us to identify exactly who has the highest need of food insecurity, and we target those people, and those are our beneficiaries. During the food distribution itself, we use things like biometrics, either iris scans, thumbprints. We have many ways that we go. We have on-site visits to make sure that during the distribution, the right people that we've targeted at the beginning are getting the food when we're distributing the food. We also do re-verification of beneficiaries throughout the program. So just because we started with a beneficiary list, we then verify it throughout the course of the program to make sure that there's no deviation in the targeting of the beneficiary. And then after the beneficiary, we also do constant monitoring. We have hotlines in places like Yemen where it's hard to get access, where people that are beneficiaries can call. We do random calls to beneficiaries if they have phone lines. We have the Inspector General that goes and does independent assessments, and we have third-party monitoring. There's quite a wide variety of tools that we have that we're constantly making sure that our program is working the way it should be working.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. His time's expired, and Chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Connecticut.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I've spoken on many occasions about my commitment to ensuring that all children receive healthy meals, because I've been on the other side of a classroom where a kid returned on a Monday morning having not eaten with their head on a desk. And the one thing that I know for sure is that hungry kids do not learn. That reality holds true across international borders as well. In 2016, I was the National Teacher of the Year, and I traveled with the U.S. State Department to many of the countries that we're discussing today. And I saw firsthand how our aid improves the safety and stability of nations across the globe and fosters goodwill. I also saw how those communities relied on this aid. Right now, in many of those countries that I visited, I see how drought has caused food shortages, jeopardizing school meals for more than 800,000 children. McGovern Dole is one of the most effective tools to prevent against such threats and ensure students across the globe are not distracted from learning because they're wondering where their next meal will come from. Since its establishment, since the establishment of this program, we have fed more than 40 million children in 41 countries. The budget that was proposed in March suggested cutting this program completely. Mr. Isley, what would have happened to children in those countries? I guess if we had cut this program as the budget suggested, can you just tell us a little bit what that looks like and estimate how many children in schools would have lost access to school meals and nutrition programs?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. And with respect to the ongoing projects, we would have continued to implement those and work with the host governments on transitioning those programs One of the key goals of the administration is to work very closely with those host countries and to work with them actually on the implementation of laws, the appropriation of money to take over those programs and for them to graduate from U.S. assistance. So we would have continued to implement the programs existing, but would not have put in place new programs with respect to new countries or continued existing.
So it's your belief that none of those children would have lost access to meals if the funding had been cut?
Not the existing programs that have been already awarded and implemented, but with respect to any future new programs, correct, they would not have received new awards. So any programs that would have required rollover, if they would have been at their expiration, they obviously would have not received U.S. funding. We would have worked very hard, though, to see if there was an alternative with respect to our implementing partner or with respect to the host government in terms of taking over that responsibility.
They're very important programs. In the USDA's latest International Food Assistance report, it noted that, and I quote, USDA food assistance and capacity building programs are embedded with strategies intended to promote sustainability, so recipient countries can continue to benefit well beyond the funding period, much like what you just said. And you mentioned that Kenya was a major success story in those efforts. Can you please share some examples of these strategies and your efforts in other nations to promote sustainability of these programs and continued support from those domestic governments?
Yes, Congresswoman. Another example beside Kenya, and Kenya was implemented by USDA, I believe, starting in 2004. And this past year, we celebrated the turnover of that program to the government of Kenya, which is a key graduation success story. Another one I would highlight is in Burkina Faso, where we're improving literacy, health, and dietary outcomes. Since 2011, a McGovern Dole project has aimed at improving literacy, health, dietary outcomes for preschool and primary school students in north-central Burkina Faso. As of 2018, the project covers nearly 1,000 schools and preschools, serving nearly 40 million meals to more than 265,000 children. The multifaceted program has enabled a 17% rise in on-grade level literacy rates. The government of Burkina Faso has increased its public spending on school feeding in the country, allocating a budget of more than $36 million for 2018-2019 school year to cover 3 months of healthy meals for school children in 43 out of the nation's 45 provinces. So that would be an example of us working with the government of Burkina Faso on school feeding and nutrition.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I would just ask that as you look towards the next round of identifying priority countries, that you develop a system of feedback and soliciting input so that we can make sure that we are addressing the countries that are most in need. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
And I thank the gentlewoman for her line of questioning, and it would be helpful, I think, for the subcommittee, Mr. Isley, if, in fact, you provided that feedback as we go forward in your implementation of the programs you administer.
Very good, Mr. Chairman.
The next member of the subcommittee is Mr. Hagedorn from Minnesota. Gentleman has 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rouser. Pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for your testimony. I think that the programs that you're implementing are kind of twofold, show the greatness of America. First, the generosity of the American people, that we work so hard to try to make sure that our own citizens have food and are in good shape, but also millions of people around the world. And these programs also demonstrate the wonderful system of agriculture that we have, that the expertise and the technology and ag land with our farmers' hard work and the work that's done by our agribusinesses puts us in a position not just to trade with other countries and help provide food, but to literally give it away in many instances here to help people all around the world. So I think those are two things that we should always keep in mind. And that second one, I know the committee works very hard to make sure that we do everything to sustain our way of agriculture and that we continue to do that in behalf of literally everyone around the world. So With that having been said, I also want to associate myself with the comments of the folks on the committee. We're very much interested in you taking products from our farmers and sending them to other countries and not necessarily distribute cash payments. We think that that's very important. So with that, how do you select which commodities are utilized, and how do you also make sure that when we send those commodities around the world that they're not taken by some foreign leader and used for other purposes? What types of steps do you take to protect from that type of corruption? So I'll leave it up to both of you.
Sure. So to answer the first question, as I said earlier, we do a basic zero-based budget approach. Every year, we don't start with any assumption. We just look out at the world and see what the needs are, and we do an assessment on what the needs are. Each context is different. So in Yemen, there is no local market to really rely upon to provide food, so we must provide food from U.S. farmers, and in this case, it's wheat. And right now, on the water, we have 150,000 metric tons of wheat on its way to Yemen, coming directly from U.S. farmers. It's a very important part of our response there. We can't respond without it. Same thing goes in South Sudan. But if you look at a different context, like in Lebanon or Jordan, most of the refugees from Syria in those two countries are dispersed in urban areas. They're not in a central location. So it would be impossible to utilize a centralized food distribution program with large bags of commodities to reach such a dispersed population. It also has a very vibrant food market system there. So in that context, we wouldn't be able to meet the refugees with U.S. commodities, but we can meet them using debit cards at local markets. And when it comes to the oversight, it again depends on the commodity, but in places like Yemen, we utilize third-party monitoring. We have hotlines that are very successful in people calling in to let us know if there's problems. In places like Jordan and Lebanon, the debit cards use electronic banking systems where we are immediately alerted if anyone's trying to abuse those systems. So it depends on the context and the modality, but we have a whole buffet of options that we can use to conduct very rigorous oversight at every stage of the response.
Yeah, and with respect to the two USDA programs, both of those are implemented with in-kind commodities. For McGovern Dole, we have a list of eligible commodities that are appropriate to go into school meals based on nutrition. There's a set of criteria if we want to add eligible commodities to that list. That's an interagency process. For Food for Progress, it's a little more complicated because it's a monetization program. So we purchase the U.S. commodities, donate those in the local markets that are then sold to generate the money to implement those programs. There's several criteria for that in terms of rate of return, at least 70%, but also one that's very important and impacts seasonality and other things is we have to undergo a study to ensure there's no disruption to the local marketplace. So it's a combination of those factors in terms of which commodities we select, but we implement fully with commodities we purchase.
So do you account when certain ag sectors are maybe at a little bit of a low point and there's excess production? Would that be an area where you'd go in and especially try to utilize those?
Yeah, that could be one of the criteria. It's also the criteria in terms of impact on the ground where we're implementing, in terms of what the market reaction would be to the sale of that size of commodity purchases. And often we're working with host governments in that respect as well.
Thanks. My time's up. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both for being here this morning. It's always a pleasure to talk about Farm Bill oversight and the need for international food aid. I'm fiercely passionate about career skills and technical education and finding ways to add opportunities for our young people in agriculture in particular. Section 3307 of the Farm Bill creates the International Agricultural Education Fellowship Program to build capacity for school-based ag education in developing countries. Our public commitment to land-grant universities and school-based ag education programs, such as 4-H and FFA, help prepare American students for careers in agriculture. Mr. Isley, what steps has the agency taken to develop this fellowship program and ensure its focus remains on school-based agricultural education capacity building efforts?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm equally passionate about child education in agriculture. I was a member of 4-H. I was a member of FFA growing up on a farm in Iowa, so I understand the importance of those. I've had meetings with people that are familiar with this program. USDA stands ready, willing, and able to implement. Of course, as you know, it was not appropriated money in the 2019 period. We're awaiting for if that appropriation occurs, and we'll rapidly implement and provide that assistance as laid out in the Farm Bill. So it's just a matter of receiving the appropriation, and we will swiftly put in place the programming necessary to implement.
I look forward to hopefully seeing that happen and to that swift implementation. I'd also just like to continue this dialogue and continue working with the agency on this important issue. So thank you again both for being here. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield the remainder of my time.
All right, the gentlewoman yields the remainder of her time, and the gentleman, the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Marshall.
Okay, thank you so much, Chairman Costa. Kansas has a long reputation for working with Food for Peace and McGovern-Dole. The Food for Peace actually started in 1953 when a farmer from Cheyenne County, Kansas, Peter O'Brien, had the concept of sharing our commodities with people in need around the world. He went through his local county farm bureau, the state farm bureau, the American Federation Farm Bureau, and eventually a senator from Kansas, Andy Schopel, introduced it, and it became legislation in 1954, signed by then another Kansan, President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And of course, the McGovern-Dole bill is a phenomenal legislation that supports almost $1 billion a year, helping millions of people. So with that in mind, I'd like to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, a letter from 26 nonprofit, non-governmental organizations working to end hunger, poverty, and malnutrition throughout the world in support of our House Resolution 189, which recognizes the importance of sustained United States leadership to accelerating global progress against maternal and child malnutrition. You know, as an obstetrician, I think those first 1,000 days are so important, from the moment of conception being day number 1, the moment of conception when the neurological systems in those babies are developing inside the woman's womb, all the way to breastfeeding, making sure that mom has proper nutrition in those first 1,000 days of life. So I'm going to submit these for the record, please. I think my question is always in Congress. Happy to help other people out, want to make sure that we're doing this as most efficiently as possible. And you know, one of my concerns is that we're using agriculture products made here, and that's obviously a theme going on around here. I'm trying to go back to the big picture. It looks like a lot of the cash is spent in emergency situations. And my question is, do you all, like I worked with Rotary, something called a shelter box, and we didn't know exactly where the emergency was going to happen, but you could pretty much count on there's going to be 1 or 2 in Africa, the Middle East, the Far East, Central America, the Caribbean. So we would have warehouses of these shelter boxes ready and waiting. Do we have warehouses like that across the world full of commodities ready to respond as opposed to always just throwing dollars at it?
Excellent question. We absolutely do pre-position commodities. There are different types of responses. They're all emergency responses. Some of them are these long, protracted conflicts, like in Syria, in Yemen. But some of them are sudden onset that happen very quickly, like hurricanes, like we had in the Caribbean with Dorian, or the earthquake a few years ago in Haiti. And so we have to be ready for everything. So again, context matters. So in certain circumstances, we're going to need a lot of commodities to respond, and if we don't have them already nearby, we can lean into what we have.
Could you get us a map of where we're staged at, maybe?
Sure. There's Djibouti, Durban, Malaysia, and Houston are where our warehouses are, but I can provide you information on the numbers and kind of how we utilize those.
If we had more warehouses, would we be able to use more American commodities?
If we needed more warehouses, we would procure more warehouse space. Right now, we are operating at the most efficient capacity that we can have for pre-positioning versus actually using the commodity.
What else could we do to use more American commodities as opposed to cash?
So the costs that go into using commodities, a lot of it is security, a lot of it's transportation. In fact, half of it is transportation, shipping and handling, plus the administrative costs. So anything we can do to reduce those costs. So having to rely more on U.S. flagged vessels, for example, they're twice as expensive as normal vessels from other countries. That's a significant driver. Security is a significant driver. So it's the overhead costs that prevent us from using more commodities in Title II.
So last question, could you get us a graph of, since its conception in 1954, a year-to-year basis, how much of the budget is being spent on American commodities versus cash? And I'm just trying to get a feel for where we are today compared to a decade ago.
So just real quickly, Title II is only U.S. commodities. So except for about 1% is used for the flexibility. The only cash comes from the IDA account, which is a separate account. And that started probably around 2009 or 10.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. His time's expired, and the chair will now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson. Oh, I'm sorry. No. We're glad to have you here. Excuse me. Recognize the gentlewoman, please.
Yes. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions about Food for Progress. And I was hoping that some of you could tell us, either of you could tell us, as individual food programs conclude, how is the team working to bridge those efforts into mutually productive trading technology relationships?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, and that's a key objective is to ultimately bridge to trading relationships. We have numerous examples in terms of the Food for Progress projects, objectives that fit that objective. The phytosanitary objectives of some of the programs establish or help establish regulations in country that support trade and enable our farmers to utilize the technology that's approved in the U.S. To be ultimately traded with those partners. We have projects that are implementing spice, coffee, cacao that don't directly compete with U.S. agriculture that ultimately are available for purchase from a lot of our U.S. companies to utilize within the United States on their food processing and ultimate sale. Those are a couple key examples. The programs also that are extraordinarily important but smaller are Cochrane and Borlaug, the fellowship exchange programs where we're working with key thought leaders in foreign countries around adoption of technologies and some of the food safety, production, agriculture practices that we implement in the U.S. They take those back to host countries, implement those, and we continue to stay engaged with them throughout their careers that build those relationships that are critical ultimately to trade.
Do you do any of that in the Caribbean basin?
Yes, we have projects, I believe, in the Caribbean basin.
I'd love to get some information about that
Okay,
as well.
we will follow up on that.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Hicks, I wanted to ask you if you could provide some examples in Food for Peace in recent situations where in-kind food aid has been the most effective source of aid to meet the demands of the region in need.
Sure. So I've mentioned Yemen several times, but Yemen is a great example of where we don't have other options, but we have to use U.S. commodities. When it comes to nutrition, our nutrition programs, we use U.S. Peanut-based products to do therapeutic foods for that first 1,000 days that was mentioned earlier. And in a lot of contexts, like in Ethiopia and other places, we have a mixture. And it really just depends on if there aren't other options, we have to use U.S. commodities. And so it is context specific, but a lot of the countries where we do respond, we use a mixture of everything. The needs are growing, they're not shrinking. And so we have to use every single dollar that you give us. We have Title II, which is for U.S. commodities. We have IDA, which is market-based responses. We're going to use every single dollar you give us because the need is huge. But we have to look at the responses to be able to use wherever the modality is going to get us the farthest. What can we use to feed the most people in each response? It's that flexibility and efficiency that drives our decision.
And if you could tell me, Mr. Isley, what are the lasting impacts on the programs when they build technical capacity and spur local innovation?
Well, there's many lasting impacts in terms of, the targeted objectives under Food for Progress. As indicated, we specifically try to build with the foreign governments regulatory systems and processes that are very similar, that provide food safety, that provide standardization, that allow trade among the U.S. with them and other countries. They also develop agriculture sectors that develop the capacity of those agricultural sectors that provide stability for those local farmers. I'd mentioned spices, coffee, cacao. Some of those displace alternatives that are less palatable, like drugs and other things, and provide that economic stability and local market opportunities for the farmers there.
Thank you. Thanks for the time, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentlewoman and her questions as relates to the comments of your efforts in the Caribbean. I think we're all interested in the representative from the American Virgin Islands has told us firsthand of the devastation that they have felt as a result of the hurricane and still are recovering from. And so it's other parts of the Caribbean that have also as well been impacted, but we also need to take care of our own citizens, and we can and should do a better job, and we thank you for your valued input in all of these areas. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for the second time.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member. And thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Thank you for your leadership with these programs. These are, the programs that you've been entrusted to assist in leading are incredibly important, obviously. Important part of the Farm Bill, it really deals with food insecurity. I've had the opportunity to visit the warehouse in Djibouti, Africa, and quite frankly, that food is pretty effective diplomacy. And the way it's labeled, the American flag, the nutrition, it's most important, the nutrition that's within inside those packages, but how the packages are, how they're packaged as well and labeled are incredibly important. I've been to Yemen, and so, we know that how, I've seen in countries such as Djibouti, Africa, and Yemen, other places, I've seen the end result of food insecurity. And it's not good. And I know that our mission is about, is about dealing with hunger. But I was curious to get just some quick responses from each of your thoughts of, in serving the greater good in addressing hunger, what other positive outcomes are we seeing in those countries? Because I believe there are some real tangible deliverables that happen as a result of these programs beyond making sure that that individuals and families have access to nutrition and have achieved food security.
Sure. I would love to answer that question. Thank you. When people are trying to escape the conflicts and the disasters, they're on the run, and they're going to keep running until they find shelter and food and a safe place away from the conflict. And so if we're able to provide food closer to where they're at, they're not going to keep running and destabilize areas where we have very keen national security interests. So we definitely have a stabilizing effect. But there's other aspects of Title II that have long-lasting change effects on the population. And I want to talk a little bit about the non-emergency side that you guys also authorize and have oversight of. This is where we are spending development funding that you provide. We are spending development funding to places where there's reoccurrent shocks, like drought, for example, and we're teaching those communities how to adapt so they don't fall into humanitarian need. And that's a very important piece of the program that you all administer and provide for us. It is our way of preventing future hunger and future problems. It's a preventative measure, and it's also our way to connect the programs that you guys authorize into the greater development piece. It's that resilience piece that links our programs into the other development programs that get communities on their journey to self-reliance, which is something Administrator Green has made a very top priority. So the programs you have, yes, we're resolving the hunger issue, but there's national security, there's stabilization, we're creating markets, we're creating communities that are resilient and able to withstand shock. It's having a very significant impact in the world.
Mr. Risley?
Yeah, thank you very much. Going back to the Food for Progress programs, one of the key stabilities is economic stability and building capacity of agriculture industries in some of these countries. Northern Triangle is an example. Pakistan, we've got an aquaculture project going where they're developing a whole source of protein through aquaculture, which ties directly to soybean meal coming from the United States. It's expanded trade in soybeans. We're now up to $700 million of exports of U.S. soybeans to Pakistan, and that is one just example of how that can be developed and built. But it's that economic stability of teaching those practices, and also our technologies that we help implement provide environmental stability around preventing soil erosion, water conservation, and things of that nature. So long-term, lasting effects that provide for the sustainability of agriculture in those locations.
My observation, having been in countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, the two that I mentioned, Pakistan, where you have food insecurity, you have civil unrest, you have not just hunger, but you wind up with infant mortality, with illiteracy, and quite frankly, it creates the conditions where I think terrorism is fostered. So our investments that we proudly authorize within the Farm Bill process are the return on investment of that, of working towards stability, preventing terrorism, which is something that I think we're going to have to live with as a world for some time. We try to manage that and mitigate it, and I think the programs we have in the Farm Bill are to go a long way. Just one last question, and it's just a yes or no, just kind of curiosity. Do either of the agencies partner with our Institute for Peace, which is not authorized through the Agriculture Committee, it's through the Education and Labor Committee? They look at, I would recommend, because of what you do, you all need to be talking, because Institute for Peace is about conflict resolution and identifying the sort of these variables that, and food security is obviously a part of that. So thank you, Chairman.
Was that a nod that the two of you?
USA definitely partners with USIP on all kinds of issues, including conflict issues. So yes.
Not that I'm aware of in terms of USDA's programs. No.
All right. All right.
Mr. Costa, may I just
yes.
say, just your indulgence, Mr. Thompson talking about those ROIs, I think, was really important to our nation in these food programs. And I just want to also add that we just receive a blessing by being that for the rest of the world. So thank you for recognizing that.
We thank the gentlewoman for her comments. I believe the last member of the subcommittee here, although he didn't make it before 11 o'clock, and it was a kind of a close call here by your colleagues as to whether or not you should be given 5 minutes, but the chair's in a holiday spirit, so recognize the gentleman from Nebraska for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I appreciate your holiday spirit. We embrace it. I was in Afghanistan hearing from the commander of our forces in Afghanistan, so, but this is also important. I will tell you that Nebraska is proud of being like the lead exporter for beef, and you can go up and down the line. And agriculture is one of our nation's strengths, and it's a source of our nation's power and prosperity. And I just tell you, our farmers and our agriculture sector in Nebraska are proud to help feed the world. And we prefer not handing a check. We like providing our surplus, which we have. And so I really appreciate your all's part in doing that. It is a blessing, as was just mentioned, that we can help so many people out of hunger and poverty and be just a real aid to millions of people across this globe. So my first question is for Mr. Hicks. There is a crucial coalition of American farmers, shippers, non-governmental, and international organizations who work together to deliver food aid. How does USAID coordinate and accept input from all these stakeholders?
That is a great question. Yesterday, we actually held the way we coordinate. It's called the Food Assistance Consultative Group, where we bring in the maritime industry and the commodity groups and USDA, as well as our implementing partners. It's something we do annually, where we have various committees that look at different issues, and we exchange the best and latest data and information and techniques that we do on a regular basis. And that we just did it yesterday. We just chaired it yesterday, Ken and I.
Okay, and thank you very much. I turn over to our USAID leadership. Can you give some examples of typical McGovern-Dole food for education programs and how these programs help achieve U.S. assistant goals?
Yes, I would be happy to. Let me grab. So we awarded 8 McGovern-Dole projects this past year based on the priority countries. I gave an example earlier in terms of a project we've got going in Burkina Faso, and the number of children that are impacted by that at 265,000. There was also mentioned earlier in the hearing the project in Kenya that World Food Program, who's one of our implementing partners on McGovern-Dole, has implemented for many years before USDA assistance. We got involved in 2004 and worked very closely with the government of Kenya to graduate that program and turn it over to them, and that is continuing through funding through Kenya. So numerous projects, numerous programs throughout the world that we implement with World Food Program, Catholic Relief Services, many other implementing partners to deliver those nutritious meals.
Thank you very much. I'll just close again with a statement. You know, America has the ability to help so many in need. And so I appreciate you both for giving Nebraska farmers and ranchers and our ag industry a chance to be a part of that and a force for good, and we have the ability to do it, so we ought to. Thank you.
Sure.
I thank the gentleman from Nebraska, and I was making light earlier. Obviously, your meeting dealing with Afghanistan is important. I've been there multiple times, and it's a real challenge for our country as we try to assess where we are in that difficult part of the world. I will defer to the ranking member for the subcommittee now for a closing statement, and then I will conclude the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to thank our witnesses for being here today. This is a very important topic. These programs are critically important to our maintaining and enhancing our influence in the world, in addition to the humanitarian aspect and the economic development aspect of them. So we take this very, very seriously, and as I stated, and Ranking Member Conaway addressed, and and Chairman Costa has too, there's strong bipartisan support for as much in-kind food aid as possible, and look forward to working with you to enhance that aspect as we move forward. And if I can add, Mr. Chairman, just a quick request from both of you. If you can, for example, and to preface this and give you an idea of what I'm looking for, when a bank makes a loan, they know, there's a 2% default, 3% default, whatever it may be. I'd be curious to get the information from you all in terms of in-kind food aid, what percentage has been abused or misused, and then also from a cash standpoint or voucher standpoint, what percentage have you identified has been abused or misused? I'd like to know those metrics and how they stack up over time. With that, I yield back.
If you could provide that information to the subcommittee so that we can share that, the ranking member and I, with the full membership of the committee. Obviously, I think there's an interest in that as well as some of the other information we've requested from you. So if you can coordinate that. I'd like to close, but before I do, I'd like to make a statement that probably everyone's aware of at this point in time because it was released, I believe, at about 10:30, but we've reached an agreement, Chairman Richie Neal from House Ways and Means Committee with the administration on the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. There were important negotiations that took place here over recent months to try to ensure that issues of enforcement, protection of American workers, a monitoring system, accountability, and preserving Congress's power to legislate in this area as we all work to ensure fair competition was reached, and we're pleased that it was reached. And my understanding is that we'll get a chance to vote on this bipartisan agreement next week, which I think is a good sign as we see the new year coming soon. In closing, I'd like to indicate to both witnesses today, we thank you for your good work and for your efforts. We will obviously continue to provide our oversight role as it relates to USDA's efforts in the International Food Assistance Program. Some of the points that were talked about in terms of the various types of assistance that we use and which is most effective, I think will be a continuing focus. And we will also monitor the implementation of the new flexibilities that we provided last year in the reauthorization of the Farm Bill, which was part of, I think, our efforts to make our efforts more effective in the totality of the food aid that we provide. As I noted, almost $4 billion in the last fiscal year, and how it relates to local regional procurement. When we talk about all the various modes of assistance that we provide, as I noted, as the chair of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue, I'm very interested, and we have this as a part of our conversation with our allies within the European Union, that we coordinate, because I think when we coordinate well, we're more effective at providing that assistance where it's needed. Well, it wasn't discussed here today, although it was noted, that transportation is another important question, and the cost of that transportation obviously is important as we try to get that food to where it's needed as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And I think that's something that we need to have a further discussion about. Overall, I think we noted this morning that there is strong bipartisan support, as the ranking member stated in his close, and we'll look forward to continuing to find ways to promote America's efforts as we put our best foot forward in terms of our responsibility as the richest country in the world to provide support where it's most needed for humanitarian efforts, whether it be as a result of civil strife or natural disasters or the impacts of climate change. All of the above clearly are things that we have a role and a responsibility to play. And I think American farmers, ranchers, dairymen and women throughout the country feel a great sense of pride when they can not only produce enough of the finest food in the world for America's dinner table, but also enough to provide for others who are in hunger and who need it. And so for all of those reasons, we are moving forward with the resolution, which is a bipartisan resolution as it relates to our responsibility and role that we play. And we will continue to work with all of you. Please provide that information. And we have, I think, what is it, how many working days under the Rules Committee to record today's hearing. The record will be open for 10 calendar days. We'll receive any additional material, supplementary written responses from witnesses to any question posed by a member. This hearing now of the Subcommittee on Livestock and Foreign Agriculture is adjourned. Thank you for your testimony.